Thank you all for being here today. And before I begin, I should mention that this has been a collaborative effort with my colleagues from the International Center for Diarrheal Disease Research in Bangladesh, as well as my advisors and mentors here at Stanford, and my advisor from Johns Hopkins University. Hi, Peter. You're here. So when I first came to E-IPER, as Steve mentioned, I wanted to work towards solving important problems. And naturally, I imagined continuing my work in water and sanitation that I had begun during my master's degree from the University of Washington that I was pursuing in 2010. But during one of my early advising meetings with Steve, he presented me with this data from one of his cohorts in Bangladesh that showed higher than expected levels of lead exposure. Immediately, I began to think about this data, and before long, my entire dissertation revolved around lead. So why is it that I care so much about lead exposure? Well, lead is a potent toxin and damages numerous systems in the body. In the cardiovascular and circulatory systems, lead can increase the risk of hypertension, stroke, and heart disease. In the endocrine system, lead can cause hormonal imbalances. And in pregnant women, lead can enter the blood of the developing fetus. And in both children and adults, lead can cross the blood-brain barrier, where it hijacks calcium's role in neuron signaling, and can impair neuron communication and also cause neuron death. Now, this can result in permanent losses in brain volume, which is why it's so critical to reduce lead exposure, especially for pregnant women and children. This is a composite MRI from 157 individuals studied in the US from childhood to adulthood. And the orange and red regions of this image show losses in brain volume associated with lead exposure. You can see that one particular part of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, is particularly attacked, where there are more reductions in brain volume. Now, this is important because that part of the brain controls executive function and mood regulation. So it's not surprising that several studies have shown associations between lead exposure and depression, panic disorders, rise in interpersonal conflict, and increased violent crime. A lot of the sources during these studies were leaded gasoline, lead in paint, and occupational exposures. Lead can also impair cognition, as I've alluded to, but before lead was phased out of gasoline, it was actually really difficult to measure the association between lower levels of lead in the blood and this reduction in IQ. This is a pooled analysis of over 1,000 children from 7 different countries that shows the extent to which these lower levels of lead exposure, between 2 and 10 micrograms per deciliter of lead in the blood in particular, can reduce IQ. And this shows that between that 2 to 10 microgram per deciliter threshold, there's a reduction of about 3.9 IQ points. Between 10 and 20, about 1.9 IQ points are lost. And between 20 to 30 micrograms per deciliter, another 1.1 IQ points are lost. This evidence, as well as other evidence, convinced the Center for Disease Control to gradually reduce the blood lead level threshold of concern from 60 micrograms per deciliter, where it was in the 1960s, to 5 micrograms per deciliter, where it remains today. And it's worth noting that each lost IQ point translates to roughly 2% lost lifetime productivity. And when we extrapolate this to a population level, the results are astounding. In low and middle income countries, it's estimated that nearly $1 trillion in lost productivity are associated with lead exposures per year. Whew, that's a lot. In Bangladesh alone, even after lead was phased out of gasoline, the losses are estimated at about $16 billion, or 6% of GDP. And so why is it that the burden of lead exposure is so much higher in low and middle income countries? One reason may be that there are more sources of lead in the environment stemming from unregulated industries. And another may be that the response to those sources of lead is worse because of nutritional deficiencies. Studies have linked deficiency in calcium, iron, and zinc with greater absorption of lead and also worse consequences from that lead absorption. So although lead exposure is often associated with industrial sources, a couple of cross-sectional studies have indicated that between 54 to 78% of children have elevated blood lead levels in rural Bangladesh, where there are no known industrial sources and where it's a mostly agrarian society. This can be compared to the US, where the prevalence of elevated blood lead levels are less than 3%, And even in Flint, Michigan, after the switch from the water source that resulted in the release of lead into the water, the prevalence of elevated blood lead levels rose from 2.9 to 4.9%. So this evidence really motivated us to ask, why are blood lead levels elevated in rural Bangladesh? And to answer this overarching question in my dissertation, in the first and second chapters, I look at where the lead is coming from, using a combination of environmental health and geological sciences methods. And then in chapter 3, I dig a little bit deeper to understand one source and the incentive structure around that source in order to understand how we can prevent it. So now for the first chapter, there are two more specific questions associated with this. One is, what is the prevalence of elevated blood lead levels? And second, of course, what are the sources of the lead? There have been a number of hypothesized lead sources in rural Bangladesh, but no conclusive evidence. Some of these studies have been retrospective studies that have shown an association between elevated blood lead levels and certain sources like indigenous or Ayurvedic medicines. Other studies have used environmental sampling techniques and have shown elevated concentrations in turmeric, rice, and agrochemicals, as well as the agricultural soil to which it was applied, and soil and clay, and particularly soil and clay that's consumed by pregnant women to alleviate nausea. So both of these methods, using the retrospective reported behavior correlations and the environmental sampling methods, have certain weaknesses. Reported behavior is subject to recall bias and, of course, is subject to asking the right questions. And the environmental sampling indicating elevated lead concentrations in sources may not necessarily translate to elevated lead exposure in humans because, of course, this is related to human behavior, such as consumption, as well as the form of lead and how readily it's absorbed into the body. So we wanted to combine these methods and do this within a nested case control study. So we randomly selected 430 pregnant women from 4 different districts in rural Bangladesh, and these were selected from within a larger study, the WASH benefits trial, which is the water and sanitation health-related trial led by Steve Luby and colleagues at UC Berkeley. Among these women, we measured the blood lead levels and to understand the distribution of the blood lead levels. And then we also selected cases with elevated lead concentrations and controls with lower levels of lead in their blood. And within this case control study, we assessed reported behavior for potential exposures, and we also collected a bunch of environmental samples, including those that I hypothesized, as well as others that have been hypothesized from other regions. We measured these using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry and also X-ray fluorescence here at the Environmental Measurements Laboratory at Stanford. So in terms of the distribution of blood lead levels, we found these to be right skewed among these women, and 31% had elevated lead levels. From this, we selected 57 cases with greater than 7 micrograms per deciliter of lead in their blood, and 59 controls with less than 2 micrograms per deciliter. Now, in terms of the reported behavior, we found overall 3 main types of exposures. And what I'm showing here is the prevalence of reporting these behaviors among cases and controls, as well as the odds ratios. So what this means is that cases with elevated lead concentrations in their blood were 2.6 times more likely to report consuming food from cans. They were also 3.3 times more likely to report grinding rice. And they were between 2 and 3 times more likely to report using several types of agrochemicals, different pesticides and herbicides. All of the other associations with the reported behavior were not significant. And so among these 3, one of these, the cans in particular, had elevated lead concentrations during our environmental sampling. However, these weren't the type of can you may think of when you first think of consuming food from cans. These were these 5-liter cooking oil cans shown here. And they had been recycled, and lead solder was applied at the seams of these cans. Now, colleagues used linear accelerator imaging to show this. So this is actually the seam of the can. And you can see in green, there's the lead, and in red, we have the iron showing the cross-section of the seam of that can. From the environmental sampling, there were 2 other sources that had elevated lead concentrations. One of these was turmeric. Now, these are 17 different randomly selected turmeric samples, and one of them in particular has over 100 times the Bangladeshi Standard and Testing Institution's limit, which of course there's no safe level, but of 2.5 micrograms per gram. So you can see this kind of striking feature of this graph is this one sample. Another type of source, the soil and clay consumed by pregnant women, also had elevated lead concentrations. The average there was about 36 micrograms per gram. The image on the left is a vendor who actually sells clay pots and other things, but also clay tablets which are specifically formulated for pregnant women. You can see them in the forefront of the image. And the image on the right is an image of a woman scraping away some soil from a burner. And this is the type of soil that was reported to be consumed to alleviate nausea. Now, putting this all together, this table shows the results of overall 5 different potential sources, combining the reported behavior and the environmental sampling. And as we know, only 3 of these had elevated lead concentrations. So moving into chapter 2 and thinking about this question a bit further, we focus on these 3 sources: the cans, the soil and clay consumed during pregnancy, and turmeric. And I ask a more specific question, which is which sources contribute most to elevated blood lead levels? So which are actually ending up in humans? To do this, I collaborated with others in geology, and we conducted an lead isotope fingerprinting study. This is something that's often done to link lead in sources and lead in humans, or to track the fate of lead in the environment. There are 4 different isotopes of lead, and 3 of these, lead 206, 207, and 208, are radiogenic, which means they're formed from the radioactive decay of uranium and thorium. Now, because most physiological processes and most industrial processes do not affect the relative abundance of these isotopes, we can use the relative abundance to actually link the lead in the sources and the lead in the blood. This requires us to have 3 conditions, however, and one of these is that these sources have distinct isotope ratios, meaning they come from different ores and different origins. The second is that we have the tools to precisely measure these differences and actually detect them. And the third is that we've sampled the relevant sources. And this is really one of the benefits of having done the study in chapter 1 before this, because we had a really good understanding of the exposure context. So for this isotope study, we obtained samples of these 3 sources and related samples. For the cans, we included 5 samples of the lead solder from these cans. We also went back to some of the residents and sampled from 20 residents' cans, the food within the cans, and measured the lead concentrations. We found that 3 of these contained elevated lead concentrations, and these were mostly rice. So we included these in the sampling as well. For the soil and clay, we included 16 samples of the clay tablets as well as the soil. And this is likely lead of geogenic origin, therefore we only included these samples. And for the turmeric, we went back to the residents and obtained samples there. We also obtained samples from nearby markets, including 16 samples of turmeric root and turmeric powder. Now, initially, we thought perhaps the lead in this turmeric was from the soil, from agricultural origins. However, we found something surprising when we went back to the supply chain. When we went to look at the process by which turmeric roots are tumbled around, as in they're mixed together to rub away the dirt and debris and to bring out the inner color of the root by rubbing away the outer skin, we found that polishers during this process were adding a lead chromate pigment. So we included 3 samples of this lead chromate pigment in our analysis as well. And in terms of the blood, we included 45 samples from the women in chapter 1. So altogether, we did these analyses at the PicoTrace Clean Lab facility using ultra-pure reagents. We dissolved all of these samples, and then we purified and separated the lead using anion exchange columns in the lab. And these are very small columns. which is contrasted by the instrument we use to measure the isotope ratios, which is a very big instrument, takes up an entire room. It uses magnets to separate mass based on charge. And again, this was critical for getting that precision to actually detect the differences in the isotope ratios. So we graphically represented these results. And here's an example of what you might see from theoretical data before I show you the actual data. So plotting 207, 206 versus 208, 206 isotope ratios. You could imagine lead solder being in one quadrant, turmeric and soil in another, and blood being closer to any of one of these, indicating more contribution from one of those sources. For the real data, we found the lead isotope ratios of the can-related samples to be highest. We also plotted a point from a previous study of Indian solder as a reference point. And the soil and clay isotope ratios were the lowest. And again, we found a reference point from the Brahmaputra River, which runs through India and Bangladesh, so soil from that river. And then the turmeric and lead chromate pigments were in between, mostly centered around one lead chromate pigment. And then the blood was most clustered around these turmeric and lead chromate isotope ratios. This is the estimated 95% confidence interval error ellipses that indicate, again, that soil and clay and cans are most distinct, and blood and turmeric are most similar in terms of their isotope ratios, suggesting that turmeric contributes most in terms of the lead. An alternative hypothesis, or an alternative explanation for this, could be that because these three sources are linear related, that the blood isotope ratios are actually the result of some mixing between these three sources. Now, if this were the case, we would expect the isotope ratios to be more distributed, have some trailing and distribution between the soil and the clay and the cans. And we also can think about the consumption behavior and see if this lines up with the isotope data we see. So here I'm showing some data that shows the prevalence of reporting consuming each of these potentially contaminated sources. The data is obtained from Chapter 1, as well as an ongoing study of over 500 women in one of these study districts. And you can see that this data also supports our conclusion from the isotope ratios. The prevalence is very low for reporting consuming soil and clay and food from lead soldered cans. Less than 1/4 of these women reported that, whereas everyone reported consuming turmeric on a daily basis. So moving forward, this was a really huge finding for us, that lead chromate pigment added to turmeric is ending up in the blood of these women. So what we wanted to do is dig a little deeper to understand the root of the problem. And also to understand the incentive structure, to understand how we can prevent exposure from this source. So in Chapter 3, I asked two specific questions. One is, to what extent are these lead chromate pigments being added to the turmeric? And what factors affect this practice throughout Bangladesh? First, a little background on turmeric. It's a root, a relative of the ginger root, and it's grown predominantly in India, but also in Bangladesh, Myanmar, Nigeria, and China. Colloquially, it's known as the golden spice or Indian saffron, and it's often added in South Asia in its powdered form to foods and curries, especially to enhance the color. It's also been consumed medicinally throughout South Asia for millennia. And even more recently, in the US and other high-income countries, turmeric is being taken as a supplement because of its active component curcumin, which has anti-inflammatory and other healing properties. So despite this widespread consumption, there have been a number of turmeric recalls in the US and in other countries due to excessive levels of lead. Since 2009, there have been 9 different recalls of turmeric, including 1 curry powder, of which turmeric is the primary ingredient. This has included 17 different brands, all imported from India and Bangladesh. And at the time of these recalls, they had been distributed to at least 7 different countries. So in addition to this recall data, which is the prevailing evidence about this phenomenon, there was that one study conducted in 2014 that showed elevated lead concentrations in turmeric in one district in Bangladesh. So moving forward, we wanted to understand this phenomenon further and do a more systematic investigation of this. This map shows data we obtained from the Bangladesh Agricultural Authority of the hectares of turmeric production, specifically in our study districts. And we selected these study districts, particularly the 3 districts in the northwest, 2 in the north, and the 3 in the southeast, because cumulatively they produce 50% of the nation's turmeric, and they're the major turmeric producing districts. We also included 1 district in the southwest, and although the production volumes are very low, the turmeric grown in that district is very well known for its high quality throughout Bangladesh. We also included 2 districts, Dhaka and Munchiganj, that do not produce a lot of turmeric. Rather, Dhaka is the nationwide hub for turmeric distribution and sales, also where the capital city in Bangladesh is, and Munchiganj, which is the location of that previous study indicating elevated lead concentrations in the turmeric. In all of these districts, we conducted semi-structured interviews, and we sampled for turmeric and other samples. We used a snowball sampling approach to select a few different individuals from each point in the supply chain, including growers, processors, grinders, and these processors are specifically the polishers who are adding the lead chromate pigment that we found from chapter 1. And on the consumption side, we selected several individuals who are distributors, who are vendors, both wholesale and retail vendors at different bazaars, as well as company representatives who package and sell and distribute and export turmeric. We also included consumers, households, and individuals purchasing small amounts of turmeric, as well as hotel and restaurant managers who purchase large amounts of turmeric. And on the regulation side, we included food safety inspectors and law enforcement officers from all of these different districts. So with all of these individuals, we probed about perceptions of and preferences for turmeric quality, as well as different pressures to adulterate with lead chromate pigment. To inquire about turmeric quality, we used these different 9 turmeric root samples we obtained that represented a range of turmeric types from throughout Bangladesh. And the respondents were able to interact with them and discuss their turmeric quality preferences. Sensory attributes of turmeric quality include things like the shape of the root, the size, the color, the smell, and the oil content. And we also used an adapted version of the World Color Survey, which you can see on the right. This man is using it to point to different colors as he's describing his turmeric preferences. We conducted these interviews in Bengali and then transcribed and translated them and used deductive and inductive coding processes to understand themes related to this turmeric quality, patterns of consumption, and pressures to adulterate. Overall, we conducted over 150 interviews from these different individuals. Now, on the sampling side, we sampled turmeric roots from all of the districts at the wholesale and retail vendor locations, so the major turmeric wholesale and retail bazaars. We sampled all of the unique types of turmeric. So if turmeric from one district were represented multiple times in a bazaar, we'd only sample it once. And this included many forms of turmeric. It could include the raw and dried forms of turmeric roots, unpolished roots, which are either in the finger form, which are long and skinny, or the bulbs, which are rounder, as well as the polished roots, and the loose turmeric powder, which is scooped out of burlap sacks and sold that way, as well as the packaged powder, which of course is distributed in smaller quantities around the country as well as exported. In total, we had 340 different samples of turmeric from these districts. Now, in just the turmeric producing districts, we visited all of the major turmeric polishing mills. And we sampled further for evidence of turmeric adulteration with this lead chromate. This included over 200 samples of unpolished and polished roots, yellow pigments, and dust from below the polishing machines, as well as within or inside these polishing machines. For all of these samples, we measured lead and chromium concentrations, again using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry and X-ray fluorescence here at Stanford. So first, I'll share a little bit about the extent of lead chromate adulteration of this turmeric by showing the turmeric lead concentrations. This data is from Dhaka and Munchiganj. so not the turmeric-producing districts. And these are box plots where the box represents 50% of the data. From here, you can see that the roots themselves did not have lead, detectable lead, but the polished roots, and particularly the polished bulbs, had very high lead concentrations. The loose turmeric powder had quite a range, but you can see the maximum concentration here is 1,200 micrograms per gram. So again, much, much higher than that standard set by Bangladesh of 2.5. And of course, no level is safe. We can contrast this with the data from the turmeric-producing districts. And from this, we see that, again, the roots did not have lead concentrations. And the pattern remained that the polished roots and polished bulbs had more lead, but overall, the lead concentrations were much lower in the turmeric-producing districts. It's worth noting that all of these samples that had elevated lead concentrations also had elevated chromium concentrations. And some data that I'm not showing here are samples we obtained of the packaged turmeric powder. We obtained 25 different samples of the packaged turmeric powder, which represented 8 different brands. And of these, 2 had elevated lead concentrations, although the maximum was 26 micrograms per gram, so lower than we see in the roots and the loose powder in particular. Overall, in Dhaka and Munshiganj, 26% of samples had elevated lead concentrations, compared to 11% in the turmeric-producing districts. But still, we see quite high levels of lead. Now, in terms of the extent of lead chromate adulteration across Bangladesh, this map shows the percent of polishers using pigment in each of these study districts. And overall, we found that 7 of the 9 major turmeric-producing districts had evidence of lead chromate adulteration, quite widespread. And in particular, evidence was very strong in the northwest and northern regions, those 5 districts. In the southwest, in Khulna, again, where that high quality of turmeric is from, there was no evidence of lead chromate adulteration. So now I'll share some data related to the qualitative interviews, first sharing a bit of a historical perspective of the events that have affected lead chromate addition. We found that a flood in 1988 caused catastrophic damage to the turmeric crop of that year. And it made it very difficult to dry the turmeric roots that year. In addition, there was a rise in imported Indian turmeric, which had a beautiful yellow exterior and was very well dried, well polished. And as a result, the wholesalers in Dhaka reported going to the market and trying to find some form of yellow powder that they could add to the turmeric. It just so happened the cheapest yellow powder available at that time, which is still the cheapest yellow powder we find available in Bangladesh, was lead chromate. So here's a video of a present-day polisher using a manual turmeric polishing process where he's adding the lead chromate powder, and he'll continue to use his feet to mix around the roots. Again, the process of mixing around the roots, rubbing away the dirt and debris, bringing out the inner yellow color, and in the case of many of these, as well as the flood from 1988, this facilitated the sale of poor quality roots and allowed them to still make a profit. This man and the other polishers we spoke to generally did not understand that lead chromate is a potent toxin. Rather, they did recognize that adding a chemical to a turmeric root makes the product less pure. So after this flood in 1988 and through the subsequent decade, the practice of adding yellow pigment spread throughout the country in all of the major turmeric-producing districts. And then in the 2000s, the adoption of polishing machines from India actually overall reduced the need to add lead chromate pigment. This is because these polishing machines made it quicker and more effective in terms of polishing the turmeric roots. However, you'll notice the dust that builds up below these machines, and that's because for every 10 to 20 minutes of polishing, the polishers lose about 10% of the turmeric by weight that falls out, mostly the dirt and debris, through those holes. But by adding the lead chromate pigment, it actually shortens the amount of polishing time needed, and again, individuals can have more throughput and more profit. And of course, the polishing of poor quality roots with lead chromate pigment still continued. So in this past decade, these international recalls, including those I mentioned in the US, disincentivize polishers from adding turmeric, but mostly to the export-bound turmeric. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that soon. So now I'll share some of the findings related to the production, consumption, and regulation factors associated with the addition of lead chromate today. On the production side, we found that the regional cultivar, and particularly the type of turmeric and its inherent quality, greatly impact whether or not and to what extent the lead chromate is being added. This is one farmer who, from the Southwest, the high-quality, well-known turmeric, who was proudly broke open the turmeric root and showed me the beautiful yellow color inside. He used evocative language to describe this, calling it the color of gold and the color of egg yolks. And he was really proud that, this type of turmeric, you can polish it and it gets a beautiful color on the outside without the need for anything. Wholesalers in Dhaka mentioned that turmeric from Myanmar, unfortunately, would arrive in Bangladesh, and maybe it wasn't dried adequately or it wasn't clear, but the inner color they described as blackish, and often said they would require lead chromate in order to sell. In terms of another production factor, the drying conditions in particular affect the extent of lead chromate addition, as I alluded to with that flood. One polisher mentioned that if turmeric gets wet in the rain, no matter how you polish, good color will not come out. Then you have to add color to sell it in the market. This is related to the fact that drying is a very simple process in which you lay the turmeric roots out under the sun, and depending on the region and depending on the year, this can take 10 days or more. Farmers and polishers in the Southeast region mentioned that in 2017, it was a particularly good year and particularly sunny, meaning that they didn't have to add very much lead chromate at all. So yearly variations in this weather were affecting whether or not and how much turmeric was being adulterated. On the consumer side, we found that consumer demand for yellow-colored roots incentivizes the addition of pigment. However, from the interviews we learned that consumers who are aware of or able to assess the true quality of these turmeric roots would not be fooled by the yellow exterior of the roots alone. And a polisher mentioned that those who know turmeric, they will always buy colorless turmeric, referring to the roots. On the other hand, those who only go by looks, they will buy colored turmeric. This is an image from a wholesale vendor at a bazaar. And you can see the many different types of turmeric and colors of turmeric available for sale. Most of these consumers were purchasing larger amounts of turmeric, but many of them would assess the turmeric quality by picking up the root. They would inspect the outer color, the shape, the size, and the smell before they would break open the root and inspect the inner color and rub away to see the oil content of the root. Now, this is only possible if they were purchasing the finger form of the root, which could be broken open to see, again, the true quality. And this is consistent with our sampling data, in fact, because given that the bulbs cannot be broken open, it's more frequently that they would need the coloring to encourage or entice consumers. And so lead chromate would be added more frequently, again, to fool people of the turmeric quality. Those consumers purchasing turmeric powder, however, noted that they really couldn't understand the true quality until they cooked with it at home. Because the color of the turmeric powder is not necessarily indicative of its quality. Certainly there are certain features you want to avoid, but the color itself is not enough for the turmeric powder. That's why in turmeric-producing districts, those individuals who really know the true turmeric quality mentioned that they prefer to purchase the roots so they could assess the quality better. This, again, is consistent with our quantitative data from the sampling that indicated in turmeric-producing districts where perhaps people do not demand the lead-colored roots as frequently, they would not be adding the lead chromate as much. So in terms of the regulation side, we found that national food safety inspectors were not aware of the practice of adding lead chromate pigments to the turmeric roots during polishing, and therefore they did not prioritize this in their inspection and their control. What they did describe is a practice of adding rice flour to the turmeric powder during grinding, and food safety inspectors would inspect for this, and they mentioned that this could be fined up to $7,000 and could result in a penalty of up to 3 years in prison. However, none of our interviewees actually reported seeing this enforced or witnessing any punishment. And of course, adding rice flour to turmeric powder is harmless from a public health perspective, but it does bulk up the turmeric, the product, and create a greater profit margin. On the international side, we found that these companies really learned about the process of lead chromate adulteration because of the recalls when they were facing these losses. One company representative said, "We would have never known that turmeric contained high levels of lead if we didn't export it. We would have never known if we just continued to sell it locally." So this company representative is from one of the companies that has 30% market share in Bangladesh and distributes to North America and many other countries. They suffered huge economic losses from these recalls, and as a result, they purchased an inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometer, where they decided to measure lead and numerous other compounds to ensure that they would not face the losses from these recalls. So this was very important for them, but it did segment the market because polishers, therefore, would never knowingly add lead chromate to the turmeric that's bound for these companies and for this export market. However, they continued to add the lead chromate for the turmeric at a national level that was being consumed by Bangladeshis. So overall, this study highlights the public health threat from turmeric adulterated with lead chromate, and in particular shows that this practice is still widespread despite a number of factors over time affecting this and going up and down over time. And by laying out these different incentives at different points in the supply chain, we can make some recommendations for how we could potentially reduce exposure from this source. So on the production side, we learned that the prevailing method of drying the turmeric roots was to sun dry them. So we could imagine how creating a low-cost root drying technology that's weather independent and making this more accessible to the farmers and polishers could perhaps reduce the need for adding lead chromate, especially during those wet years. And this may become more important because we know that Bangladesh is one of the countries most prone to the adverse effects of climate change, sea level rise, and flooding. And therefore, wet years may be on the rise, and the incentives to add lead chromate may continue. On the consumer side, we learned that consumers who are unaware of the true quality and lack the ability to assess the quality of turmeric demand this yellow-colored turmeric. So we could imagine how efforts to create awareness about the true quality of turmeric and about the toxic effects of lead chromate could actually shift consumer behavior, possibly encouraging them to purchase more of the roots as we saw in the turmeric-producing districts. And on the regulation side, we found that these food safety inspectors are unaware of the problem and therefore not prioritizing it, and that perhaps equipping them with a detection and monitoring tool to actually make this invisible toxin more visible could create awareness and galvanize resources among different stakeholders, including the government and the public. So my dissertation set out to unravel this puzzle of why there are elevated lead levels in rural Bangladesh. I've identified that a lead chromate pigment added to the turmeric root is getting into the blood of residents in these rural districts. And I've shared some incentives of the different actors across the supply chain that actually perpetuate the addition of this lead chromate pigment to the turmeric root. And by thinking about these incentives and making these recommendations, we're now in a position to do something about that. So I'm really excited that my team and I are raising funds to actually develop and implement these solutions so we can see a reduction in this problem in the future. Thank you. Should we do Q&A first, or should I do acknowledgements? Okay. We can do Q&A, and then I'll share the, yeah, sounds good.
lead in turmeric that might be a lot cheaper. Is that something
Right.
you're exploring?
So we explored different colorimetric techniques. Like for paint, there's the colorimetric technique that looks at the lead oxide. And we actually found that although rhodozonic acid is supposed to work with like lead and chromium, um, it must be something about the curcumin being such a powerful natural coloring agent that we just didn't get that to work. And it also could be that the concentrations for the powder where that might be, well, where we, I don't know, the concentrations, there may be a detection threshold that's a problem too. But we did test that out, and we just couldn't see a color change like we're supposed to. It works really well for the lead oxide in the solder of the cans. It's maybe something I think it's a really good point, and I think we should continue to explore it. But the current kind of method, the rhodozonic acid, wasn't working for us. Yeah, yeah, it's a good question, yeah.
What are the other uses of lead chromate in society? Why is it so readily available and cheap?
Yeah, actually, it's still being used in the US in many cases for traffic, paint on traffic. I believe Europe and several countries, including the leading producer of lead chromate pigment, finally decided, okay, maybe we shouldn't be making lead chromate pigment to begin with. But for kind of industrial painting purposes, it's still widely used. And in Bangladesh, people reported, the people selling the lead chromate reported using it in the plastics industry, so for dyeing plastics, as well as in furniture staining. Those were the two main ones. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question, yeah. 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 So I have general thoughts about that, but unfortunately we didn't include that metric in our study, mostly because we had a small team and we kept having to go back during different times of year, and actually seasonality affects the price a lot. So during turmeric season, the prices of all of the turmeric roots are much lower than they are off season. So I can't remark specifically, but I can say that it is certainly a factor, and I glossed over it for the purpose of the story, but of course the consumers who are most price sensitive sometimes just don't have a choice. And so they purchase the cheapest turmeric, and oftentimes the poorer quality roots that need the lead chromate are cheaper. So, yeah.
Thanks for that presentation.
Yeah.
Quick question.
Yeah.
First, I thought it was really interesting you mentioned that the food safety inspectors that you talked to said they weren't aware of this lead
Yeah.
chromate addition. So I was wondering, in your work, how did you decide to look at turmeric as a source of lead when you were thinking about different sources of lead and looking at that? I was just wondering where that came from. And the second question I had was, have you come across literature, or have you looked at, turmeric and turmeric use, and then harmful addition of different chemicals in food processing isn't just limited to Bangladesh, that region. You have
Mm-hmm.
India, Pakistan,
Yeah.
different countries that have these. Have you looked at prevalence of this process in other places?
Yeah, okay, good question. So as for the first one, the isotope data really convinced us that this is an important source. Turmeric was something we needed to focus on further. So that's why we continued on with turmeric. In terms of whether or not this is a problem elsewhere and the type of data available to provide evidence for that, overall, I would say there's not a lot of data outside the media and these recalls. There are a few studies, though, one in Pakistan. I think there were only 10 samples in the entire study, but they showed very, very high levels of lead and chromium, again, in the roots, the polished roots. This is an old study. There is indication from a study that looked at spices in Boston, I believe, and elevated lead concentrations. The recall data and the study kind of reporting about that showed, again, that India and Bangladesh, but particularly Bangladesh as of late, this was a study within the past decade, the more recent studies, showed elevated lead concentrations. So we see evidence from that. In terms of other colorants and other problems, in India, there's a lot of evidence about methanol yellow, which is another yellow compound being added to turmeric root. But yeah, surprisingly, the data about this comes, there's an interesting site online where it's an Indian grandmother talking about what you can do to make sure your spices are pure. And she discusses these problems like metanol yellow and lead chromate. So it's something I think kind of known, but people didn't, I haven't seen a lot that talk about the incentives and why this practice is continuing outside of Bangladesh or in Bangladesh. Yeah, yeah, thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Josh. Yeah. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. There were, well, one comment about the lead chromate, because I didn't highlight as much in the talk, is that it goes by many names colloquially. And so that we found 80% of these compounds, they don't call it lead chromate, of course, but they have many Bengali names for it. 80% of them were lead chromate, and 20% were something else. Of those 80%, India and China were the main producers of the lead chromate, and so it was being imported. There was no production of lead chromate that we found in Bangladesh. And I think one interesting fact is the color sellers at the color bazaar, on their little business cards, on the back, if you flip it over, it says, "Do not eat these pigments." So, yeah. They would sell a number of types of yellow, most of them being lead chromate, and I think they kind of knew, but yeah, they weren't safe. Okay. Okay. Yes, because I'm going to talk about each individual. It's going to take a while. I'm kidding. No, but truly, this PhD has been such an incredible journey, and the support of so many people. But first, I should thank my committee. So I remember right before quals, when I was telling someone about my committee composition, her response was, "Wow, Jenna, you chose well. What a fantastic committee." And I really agree with that. I feel I've been valued both as a person and a researcher just throughout the whole process. That's been really important. So Steve, it's really hard to provide just one example because you've been at the center of all of this, and I appreciate all of that. I'm so thankful for your dedicated mentorship that began even before I started at Stanford. And as you mentioned in your introduction, yes, about, I think it was barely a week after I accepted, we were on the phone and then over email and dreaming up solutions to global health problems, writing proposals, because I said, I want to get better at grant writing. So we jumped in, and I've learned so much from your approach and also your focus on actually taking the time to develop and think through what these solutions are. I think I naively thought, let's jump into the solution. Okay, we know lead's bad, let's go. And it's taken a little bit of time to really understand the nuance to be at that point, and I really appreciate your mentorship through that process. I always felt so re-energized too to think about this further after our meetings, and I am grateful for your inspiration and enthusiasm. And Nicole, thank you so much for your thoughtful questions that really made me think more about the nuance of all of this, especially related to the sociocultural context. I also really appreciate how you've made me feel welcome at Stanford. You also wrote an email right after my acceptance that I just knew, I was like, oh, this is going to be great, and it has been. And you've always supported and joyfully acknowledged all of my diverse interests, which is really helpful. And Scott, I appreciate how you welcomed me into your lab, and you are such an incredible teacher. You've helped me understand everything from the biogeochemical mechanisms to some of the most creative approaches and techniques or applications for laboratory techniques. Like, I still remember the anecdote about I think it was the 10th century papyrus manuscripts that were being decoded using the linear accelerator. So I always really appreciate things like this and leaving these meetings with new pearls of wisdom and new curiosities. And Peter, who's online, thank you so much for always being ready and willing to discuss anything, anytime, and anywhere. It's really incredible, over WhatsApp, over phone, over email, in the field, over breakfast, over everywhere, every time. I'm so grateful for the way you've shared new ways of thinking, always these divergent ideas that say, oh, wow, this is, of course we should be thinking about this. And it has sparked lots of new approaches as well. Like, I think when you encouraged me to display the poster board of spices among and to spark discussions among the Bangladeshi villagers, that was really fun, first of all, but also provided a lot of incredible insights, and I appreciate all of that. So in addition to my committee, of course, I won't actually be able to talk about everyone, and there are even more, of course. But a huge thanks to Kate for chairing this dissertation, and also to Kate and Carrie for the support in the isotope lab. Thanks to other faculty, Desiree LeBeau, for including me in your work in Kenya. They've enriched my experiences. And I'm so grateful for Sue and all the E-IPER staff, as well as Jill Mueller, who's, I don't know if she's here, but she's worked many miracles, not the least of which was getting over 300 samples of agrochemicals from Bangladesh to the US. I apologize for all of the headaches, but I'm very grateful for the support. And Guangchao Li, I'm so appreciative of all of your support in the lab and putting up with the flood of turmeric samples that came into the Fendorf lab. And there are numerous students, thank you all, from E-IPER, from social ecology, from the Luby, Fendorf, and Ardoin, LeBeau labs, for so much collaboration, camaraderie. And of course, this wouldn't have been possible without my dedicated field team, the study participants, and my family, my growing family, in fact, who's taking care of the newest edition. My parents, Alan K., David, my husband, who always had my back.